Hey guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is October 4th, 2019, and today we're going to be doing a um, personal video day, and I'm going to be just sort of riffing on a topic I'd just like to talk about, which is migration. Um, as scary as a topic as this may be, it hasn't really been in the news lately. The migrant crisis sort of hit its peak in 2015, 2016. Got really scary there for a bit, and then the whole thing just sort of died down a little bit. Of course, the Syrian civil war got a little bit less severe, and um, don't get me wrong, there are still streams of migration into Europe and the United States, but for right now in the United States, the situation at the southern border apparently has calmed down quite a bit since the Trump administration did whatever haranguing they did with the Mexican government, and then on the other side of the Atlantic, apparently they've been cutting deals with the Turks and keeping migrants pretty much on the continent, on continental Asia, on Africa, and not coming into Europe. Although some would argue that the damage is done. I don't know too much about that. Um, but I'm just sort of to sort of focus today's talk. Um, I want to talk a little bit about migration in the context of Christian charity, in the context of the Christian right or the traditionalist right within Western countries. Because right now, there is a bit of a tension within traditionalist Christianity, within traditionalist circles uh, in the West, because on the one hand, we want to be able to preserve, to conserve our countries. On the other hand, it seems like our religion is trying to impress upon us that we have a duty to some extent to these migrants. Now, of course, to look at the whole framing, right, the right's in a really bad position with migration in general. Here, let me pull up my notes. Uh, yeah, my notes have brightened the screen a little bit. It's like a cave in here. Um, but looking over my notes, um, I the first thing I want to talk about is that the migrant crisis, migration in general, the problem migration, presents a real danger for the right wing in both a spiritual and a material sense. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in a spiritual sense, if we have hard hearts to these people, many of which, genuinely are suffering people, then it kind of it kind of makes our piety ring hollow. At least to most people, it definitely doesn't have the effect of making Christians look good in the public square. And of course, as part of this internecine left and right dichotomy that's being waged in all of these countries, the left has the right wing in kind of a vice grip with mass migration because on the one hand, they are definitely, most definitely, using migration of peoples as a weapon against the right, either to drive votes or to speed the dissolution of traditional culture in these countries. Uh, but on the other hand, if the right refuses to go along with this, if the right, does a hard crackdown, starts kicking people out, starts closing the borders, we are opened up to a real criticism that we are refusing to do our Christian duty. So it's hard for right wingers, especially nowadays, especially in this post mass migration era, and that's really what it is. It's an era. We've never had to deal with a historical precedent, or there is no historical precedent for what we're dealing with, because as far as I understand it, currently there are the most displaced people in the world at any point in time ever in human history. And this is remarkable because, there's no global war going on. They're, most of the states of the world are in a state of peace. So really, what it mostly is systemic drought in sub-Saharan African countries, economic poverty in these, especially in sub-Saharan African countries, and then uh, civil unrest and political instability. So a lot of African countries are in a state of civil war. Sudan, for example, they had the breakaway state of South Sudan, and then South Sudan immediately fell into civil war. So, a lot of countries in in South Africa, but also in South America, are not extremely stable. And I don't really blame people for wanting to leave those kinds of conditions. The Syrian refugee crisis is an interesting one for me, really, because, and I guess maybe it's like this to some extent. Um, Part of me is very put off by the fact that a lot of migrants that were in um, the Syrian refugee flow, right, were young men, combat capable young men, and what that says to me is that a lot of you guys, like, I can understand women, children, old people. I totally get that. But what are you guys doing, right? Because your country is in a state of civil war. You would think that they would want to stay, help either fight for the rebels or fight for the government, try to stabilize the country. It almost seems like these people uh, don't want to be there, which I don't have any firsthand experience of Syrians and how they feel about things, but it doesn't really seem like they like Syria very much, even before the war. It seems like they were just looking for an excuse to leave. But on the other hand, I've never been presented with a situation where my country is in civil war and I have to choose to either fight or flee. So I don't know what I would do in that situation, but that is curious to me. That's a little bit of a tangent, though. It's not really popular. One thing I will say is it's not very popular nowadays within right wing circles to say that one has a duty to the immigrant or the refugee that might equal that duty which you have to your countrymen. Uh, this is for a lot of good reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of people who want to interpret love your neighbor as yourself as being completely exclusive to other people, people beyond. And that I don't think is what, Jesus was trying to do with giving people that commandment. I don't think he was trying to tell people that you can only love the people that you find yourself, that are like you, that are in your area necessarily. And to demonstrate this, I would just point out the parable of the Good Samaritan. The scribe in the parable of the Good Samaritan is very much like the right wing person of today. He realizes the implications of what Jesus has just said, and he really wants to press him on this point about who is your neighbor. And if you remember the parable, the man, he's beaten by robbers and they leave him for dead in a ditch. The Levite goes past him. The wealthy Jew, I think, goes past him. And at the end of the story, the Samaritan helps the man who's been robbed. And Jesus asked the scribe, which one of these men was a neighbor to the other. And so it's very obvious that when Christ uses this kind of language in the parable of the Good Samaritan, of course, in that context, your neighbor is just whoever happens to be around you that seems to need help. And a lot of times that is, the people in your immediate geographic area, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's people who come in from outside who need help. In my parish, in my college, we have a pretty substantial population of South American and Mexican, Central American migrants. And are all of them, are they illegal immigrants? I don't know, but I do know that they're not really the wealthiest people ever. They don't have a really high standard of living. They probably don't have a lot of joys in life, really, other than maybe, going to the mass, because we do offer a Spanish mass at my parish. And so those people are certainly my neighbors, I would say. And if I was to reach out to them to help them, I think I would be fulfilling what Christ was saying in the parable of the Good Samaritan, by doing that probably a little bit better than if I just sit on my hands and do nothing. Because frankly, the people around me, the people that are like me, you know, um, you know, American right wing conservative people, the people that I generally surround myself with, they're not really in the same kind of boat. They don't need help in the same kind of way. So, there's that. There's a tendency on the right wing, because we are under this political pressure from the left, and it's very obvious that if we, go whole hog on, you know, helping out migrants, it's very obvious that we're shooting ourselves in the foot. But at the same time, like I said, it's almost like, I'm not going to say we have to blunder into this trap. All I'm saying is, on the face of it, we can't go in the opposite direction. We can't just close down everything. Only white people past this point. It's not gonna fly. And there's been several responses to this problem within the online reactionary community. The most odious of which has been frankly the alt right. Not odious because I'm offended by their ideas or whatever, but odious because frankly I just find a lot of what they say kind of dumb, or at least it's kind of missing the point. Um, one of the things that I especially don't care for is is these people generally be cringier white nationalist types, and it's generally also not professing Christians who have this really sophomoric disdain for migrants as people, right? If I had a dime for every time some cringe idiot went on and on about how Africans were like chimps, like they can't help any of the things that they do, like they're pathological animals, um, I would be rich, because there are these people that think in these terms, that they'll talk about how Africans have an average IQ of 70, they're basically rocks or whatever. It's very it's very tiring, frankly, to me, because at the end of the day, these are people, right? Michael Jones took a lot of flack for, or he took some flack, I should say, uh, when he made that statement regarding Africans and Germans. He said what's the difference between a German and a Nambian or whatever he said, and he said the difference was, 1,000 years of essentially Catholic culture, of the 1,000 years of the church. But I'm tempted to agree. Maybe not 100%, but a fair amount, because yeah, I just can't believe this whole idea that there's something intrinsic in Africans that. First of all, I don't think that they're dumb as rocks. I think a lot of these people who think like this, um, haven't really met a lot of people from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, granted, I haven't met a lot either, but I think it's probably a little bit more nuanced than just everybody from sub-Saharan Africa is a retard. I think that's a little bit of a simplification, I would say, and moreover, that's not the point, right? Because smart or not, we're talking about people, you know, and generally these people would not be so upset about, um, white people who have disabilities staying in their country. White people who have mental disabilities, generally no big deal. They don't think there's some kind of, terrible threat to the society. So I don't understand why they have this hang up with. Frankly, I don't understand the hang up with race and IQ. But I did a different. I did another video with that, so I'll refer you, or refer you to that. But that's a little bit of a tangent. But I think that's illustrative of the direction that you don't want to take. And of course, we've seen we've seen what direction that went in. It was very predictable how, first it's Africans are too dumb to be integrated into our society, and the next thing it was, you know, um, South Europeans are too dumb, or whatever, and they start fighting each other, and it's dumb in my opinion. But that's just one extreme, right? And then you have the other kind of right wing person who goes off the deep end a little bit, who goes a little bit off the reservation, and just says, "Well, we've got to be nice to immigrants. We've got to, for example, give DACA amnesty, and we've got to, there's no way that we can deport these 11 million illegal people in the country, so we'll just give them amnesty." Or whatever like that. That's obviously not a solution, I should say. So, you know, the real question, I guess, is what should our response be? Should it be to ignore the plight of all these people that, for good reasons or bad reasons, and some of them do come for bad reasons, some people go to America and go to Europe to cause trouble, and some people do not. It is just like everything, there's strokes for different folks. Everybody is coming for different reasons. But regardless of the reason, it's clear that just dumping millions of people on countries that aren't prepared for them is not good for them. And dumping them on countries that are prepared for them is also not good for them. It's not good for the native population. It's not good for them. The best possible situation, of course, would be stabilizing the countries that they came from so they could stay there, but that doesn't seem to be an option for whatever reason. Obviously, we tried this a while ago. It was called colonialism, and now we're done with that because there for a variety of reasons. And so because of that legacy of colonialism, it's really hard to try to it's basically made it impossible to treat the problem at the source, because anytime you try to do some kind of genuine investment in these countries, you can't do it for free. You can't build up the political and civil infrastructure of Zimbabwe and do that for free. Just do it out of the kindness of your heart. It's just not going to happen. And then, if you try to come up with some kind of scheme where you can get it done, well, then it's neo-colonialism. Then it's racism. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. So, and if you have them sitting in apartment blocks, just in inner cities in Europe and the United States, it's not good for them either. Because frankly, the cities in Europe and the United States aren't good for the native population, so they're certainly not good for other people. It's almost like why would you bring in a bunch of people and then submit them to a form of torture? That's kind of how I feel like the inner cities in America and some places in Europe are. So, what should we do? Well, I think, as cliche as this may be, it does come down to striking a kind of balance that neither side really wants to do, right? So the left is dominated by this runaway altruism. And I don't have to tell you about the fact that the left is psychopathically altruistic. I mean, this is a well documented phenomenon. But obviously, also, there are cynical political actors, and they see the opportunity the opportunities that migration opens up for their parties to create permanent majorities, right? And the right has its own kind of cynicism, you know? Um, it is the cynicism of people who don't give handouts to homeless people because they think that they will just turn around and spend it on booze, right? And we all know this. Probably we were raised like this as children. I know I was. My parents told me, don't look at homeless people. They're just looking for handouts, and when you give them handouts, they just go spend it on drugs. Better not to give them any help. And I understand that, right? Like, I understand kind of where that's coming from. I understand how that can be a charity. If you give them handouts, then, it kind of encourages that behavior instead of going and doing something more productive. If you give them handouts, a lot of them will go buy drugs or buy alcohol, and that's obviously not good for them, you know. And I'm not going to say that some homeless people, some people that beg, and we're just using this as an example. Some homeless people are legitimately not homeless. They're just grifters. You hear stories like this all the time of homeless people who panhandle on the street, and then they get up and get in a Camaro or something and drive away. That does happen. There are people who run scams like that. But I think really this whole attitude of being fundamentally cynical towards people who are apparently in need is unhealthy, and it's unchristian, right? The thing about cynicism is that the cynical person, if someone is cynical, it generally means that there is a defect within their own character that they don't want to rectify, they don't understand fully. And because in them there's always a defect, for example, that perhaps they only do good things for recognition, or they're like the priest in the temple, in the parable with the tax collector, where the priest goes in and he says, "Oh Lord, thank you that I'm not like these sinners." There are some people like that, and of course, not everybody, but a lot of people are like that, and so there's a form of projection that goes on with cynical people where they say that you know they can't trust people and they can't trust people's motives because their motives are always mixed. So they assume that other people's motives are always mixed. Uh, some people probably feel like I'm off base with this, but that's just my that's just been my personal experience, right? And I think not every person necessarily has to be a cynic for this kind of cynical way of thinking about the poor to catch on. And really, it's unchristian. Like I said, it's unchristian. Part of it goes back to there's especially an American component, a uniquely American component to this problem, and it stems from the prosperity gospel. Many Christians in America, including Catholics, assume that the poor are in some sense morally defective. We have internalized this idea that you are poor because you did something to get there, right? Um, a lot of people don't believe that explicitly, but they think it implicitly when they encounter people like this. So, you can apply this to the homeless person, but you can also apply this to the migrant. People are cynical about migrants. They think that migrants are only there looking for handouts. They don't think about the fact that, yeah, maybe some are looking for handouts. Maybe some people genuinely need help. And I think it would be a mistake to just dismiss those people out of hand, right? Well, it's true that the poor, the homeless, migrants, are rarely saints. I think that's fair to say. It's this whole romantic notion of poverty giving people some kind of moral superiority is just not true. So that's another sort of, you could call that a left wing myth, the myth of the saintly poor. Um, but at the same time, if you think the point of the Christian life is to avoid sinners, then I think you're kind of missing the point of the gospel. But I think everybody knows this implicitly. They don't want to get caught out. They love. I think people on the right genuinely they love their traditions. They love their homelands. And part of loving your homeland, of course, means you don't want to see it destroyed. You don't want to see it, undergo such radical change that it's never going to be the same again. It's going to do that regardless, right? But I mean, you want to have a hand in the shaping of your society. You don't want a bunch of people to just randomly show up one day. But at the same time, think of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man wanted to sit comfortably in his rich man house and do his rich man things, and he didn't want Lazarus to come into his house. He would rather have not have heard Lazarus. You know, he doesn't want his comfort interrupted. And I'm not saying this is always necessarily people's motivations, but there is a sense that, dealing with migrants, dealing with the poor, there is a sense that the Christian ideal is really losing us ground. It's losing us ground politically, and it's losing us ground materially. And so we feel like maybe if we compromise a little bit on this principle, not necessarily discard it entirely, but compromise a little bit on it, we'll get by. What what I really what I really want to see people do in real terms is not necessarily to become suddenly, open to mass migration, obviously, because as I said, that's not a solution to the problem. But what people do need to do is they do need to have a little bit of empathy. Not, I don't want people to go off the rails like a lot of left wing people do with this pathological altruism problem that they have. But, I really, it all comes down to seeing in these migrants, seeing in these people from other countries, from sub Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, from South America and Central America, just seeing them as people. They're not they're not some kind of monkeys, they're not subhuman, like some of the cringier elements of the online right think. Not traditionalists generally, but some people who swim in the same directions. And at the same time, they're not like saintly people, right? Or they're not paragons of virtue. They're just people. And I think we need to consider we need to consider our we need to consider very frankly how we're going to reach out to them as persons, and how we're going to, like we always talk about, how we're going to bring tradition, we're going to bring the right wing to the world, make the world a better place. But, this seems like a golden opportunity right on our doorstep, and I think we're just missing it. We're just whiffing on it because of all the immediate political concerns. This is another reason why we need to rise above the political and really start talking about things in human terms, in religious terms, in terms of first principles. And I think inevitably that will lead us to an understanding of migration and an understanding of the movement of peoples, that where we can look at people who genuinely need help, people who are just like any other person. They're in a position they're in a position where you yourself could find yourself. And so I think we need to have compassion for these people. And part of that compassion is to try to bring the ideas that have helped our society, the ideas that are rebuilding a traditional way of life, that are rebuilding a traditional way of understanding the world within the West, within the rubble of hedonist, consumerist, capitalist culture. We need to be able to export these ideas, because honestly, those ideas, traditionalism, reactionary thought, those ideas that not only are they going to help, I think, with the material reconstruction of these countries, but they're also going to help with the spiritual reconstruction of these countries rather. And I think that's really what we need to be looking for, right? We need to be looking to join together with people around the world in pushing ideas that are humane, in pushing an understanding of the world that considers the human person first and foremost. And that does mean putting human people above political concerns. It means putting human people above, sort of cultural concerns. Does this mean, like I said, does this mean opening up the floodgates to mass immigration? No. Does it mean engaging in, Marshall Plan style millions of dollars reconstructions of terrible countries in sub-Saharan Africa? No. Can I give you, like a step by step, what are we going to do to solve the problem? No. But what I can tell you is that instead of looking at this as a problem of groups of people bumping into each other, as the world turns, we really need to be looking at this in a human dimension, and that's what I think will help the conversation going forward. And those are my thoughts on migration. I guess I know this is a extremely rambly video, but what can I say? I have attempted to step into the 21st century and record a video using OBS and getting the return of my face on my channel. I'm not an anonymous channel. I don't really care if people know that I know who I am, or whatever. I just, I've sort of been amateurishly cutting my cutting my videos in Movie Maker from 8 years ago for the past several months, and I thought it might be time to at least attempt a little bit of an upgrade. But I don't know. It makes it a lot harder to cut out the dead air in a lot of my videos, so I'm going to have to become a better public speaker. But anyway, guys, now that you have witnessed this rambling and incoherent attempt by me to explain my thoughts on mass migration, I hope you have a good evening and God bless.